go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Today is Monday, March 18th, 2013. It's almost 10 after 2. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chairman of the Budget and Finance Committee. Welcome, everyone, to this regular meeting of the committee. We'll be hearing two items in closed session today. Those will be our first two items. We'll be taking public comment prior to the discussion of today's agenda items. And right now I have one general public comment card. So we'll go ahead and take that now. And I'd like to, there's actually no name on it, but I recognize the writing, so I'd like to invite up Dr. Weissman. Not this one. Oh, and I suppose I should have mentioned I'm Paul Krikorian, Chairman of the Committee, and I'm joined by the Honorable Mitchell Englander and the Honorable Bill Rosendahl. And we do have a quorum today, so go right ahead, Dr. Weissman.
Okay, thank you,
Dr. Weissman.
Thank you, Honorable. All you honorable gentlemen and all the honorable people in the room. It's been a very busy 2 weeks for neighborhood councils, and there's been a great deal of activity going on. Before you, you have an item called Fast and Furious. There's some more for anyone in the attending who might be interested in it. Basically, what's happened is that there have been several discussions about how the budget of the neighborhood councils would be carried out, how the budget of the elections of that are expected next year for all 95 councils, and how the budget of the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment will be treated. We are at a tipping point, as are many of the departments. A tipping point where the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment is getting close to and is speaking about the kinds of services that they're unable to provide because of inadequate staff and money. They've been cut from 62 to 19 people, expecting further cuts next year. Their budget has been cut from $4.2 million to $2.1 million, cut of 50%, more than any other department that I'm aware of. The neighborhood council allocations, which was supposed to be $50,000 a year, is $37,000 this year, proposing a 10% budget cut for across the board, and or a $7,300 cut from every council in order to pay for those elections next year. That could invalidate many of the neighborhood councils. All three of those items have been addressed and opposed very strongly by the neighborhood council budget advocates in a measure that's before you, and also by my personal neighborhood council, West Hills. Of course, that's in Mr. Englander's department. The specific language is before you. Any additional information or questions, I'd be glad to answer. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Weissman. That's the only general public comment card I have, unless someone's in the process of filling one out now. Seeing none, we'll go ahead and close general public comment. Colleagues, I'd propose items 4, 6, and 7 for consideration as consent candidates, unless anyone would like to discuss or hear those matters. 6 and 7 relate to refund claims, and 4 is approval of a contract. And without objection, those items will each be approved. We now will go to our closed session items, and I don't have any cards on items 1 or items 2, so if there are none, I'm looking for hands, and I'm seeing no hands. So we'll go ahead and close public comment on items 1 and items 2, and I'd like to ask the public to please leave the room while we conduct those closed session items. Is I'd like to.
I'll ask you whether you want to. Who? I don't think I know her.
All right, we are back in.
Oh, yeah.
We're back in open session, and colleagues, by the way, we were joined during closed session by Councilmember Koretz. Colleagues, item number 5 is also a matter that, unless anyone has any questions or concerns, I think we can also consider as a consent item. And I see no questions or concerns, so it'll be the action of the committee to approve that item as well and report the draft ordinance to council. So that brings us to our last remaining item.
Okay. That means item 3, this is a CEO report relative to options to eliminate remaining deficits and make ongoing revenues available for the fiscal year 2013-14 budget.
So I have 2 cards so far on item number 3, Dr. Weissman and Dr. Molly Rhodes. If anybody else would like to offer comment on this matter, please fill out a card and bring it forward, and we'll hear first from Dr. Weissman.
It'll still be there. Thank you so much, sir. We're about to hear from Mr. Serrano on the structural deficit as it exists now. I'm going to start with my conclusion and then go to the justification for that. Tell him you're going to tell him, and then tell him you told him. It's a good formula for a speech. Had it since high school.
Say it again.
Tell him you're going to tell him, then tell him you told him. Repetition is the mother of all knowledge, my friends. The level of the structural deficit is a very fluid estimate. We now are talking about an estimate that is, and by the way, it's in the document that's in your hands already. That was given to you in hopes that maybe some of you or your staff might even look at it before this evening. But this section is entitled Considering the Structural Deficit. We've read the Controller's annual report of March 1st, 2013, in which she predicts the amounts of income the city will receive in this fiscal year and is expected to receive in the next fiscal year. The report is one of the most important documents in the annual budget process. Let me skip through some of that boilerplate and go to point out that the structural deficits for the last 4 years, up to and including this year, are present there. Earlier, the estimate was $216 million, but with some good news, specifically some money for the CRA, money for increased property values, some increase in the property transfer tax. That's down to something of the order of $100 million, but we then also heard about $100 million of money for the police department of overtime that is still to be paid for those people. Some of that will be affected this year when some of our policemen, 300 probably, retire. And then the big gorilla this time is the federal sequestration, which may take as much as $150 million out of our coffers, both in the areas of debt service, paid and received, and then the capping idea of the 28% cap on municipal bonds may increase our interest rates in an unpredictable way, and therefore increased our costs. The bottom line is the budget deficit, if I understand it correctly, is worked on all year long, and that budget deficit isn't really gone until the end of the year in which it appears. It appears on July 1st, and we will have some kind of an idea in the first FSR of the CAO what they think it is at that point, and then you'll be spending the rest of the year trying to be sure that it ends up being zero. To that extent, this evening we'll be talking with you, I hope, about the cash flow of the city and how that can impact and how it's integrated with this concept of the structural deficit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Dr. Rhodes, welcome.
Good afternoon, Council. I'm Dr. Molly Rhodes with SEIU 721. I was part of the research team that brought you the Coalition of Unions presentation last year. So I'm here just to let you know we're still, of course, actively engaged in the budget process. I did have some questions that maybe the CAO could talk about. When I looked back at the second, when I was looking at the FSRs, so the October 12 FSR had the budget deficit number of 216, and then that number was carried again over into the early February one. But in the February one, there were numbers that should have been added and subtracted from the deficit and weren't. And so when I went back and did the arithmetic on it, the calculation that I came to was around 107 million rather than the 150 that I saw in the report. So, and just to review the numbers that I was adding and subtracting, there was a revenue growth of 55 million, a retirement cost reduction of 44 million, the encumbrances that we identified together of 18 million, and then there was an expenditure shortfall of 9.6 million. So when you add, subtract those out, that's 108 million that then should be subtracted from the 216. So just following some math. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. All right, Mr. Santana, welcome.
Good afternoon. Miguel Santana, CAO. Good seeing all of you. At the request of the Council President, immediately following the election, we issued a report to provide you and the public an update on our budget process. Again, we'll go through this tonight, but the reason why it was important to have the public consider a revenue option is that the city had essentially already cut the deficit by over 80%. The remaining amount we knew would be difficult, but certainly more difficult without additional revenue to provide us some support. The deficit the revenue was not just about 1 year, and I think that's the important thing to clarify. It was bringing the city back to some long-term financial sustainability, so we're not operating month to month, year to year. In our report, we also took an opportunity to provide you sort of where we are right now as it relates to next year. Let me talk a little bit about the deficit. We really only define the deficit officially once a year, and that's in the context of the mayor's budget. That's submitted to your council, and then when your council makes changes, that deficit gets revised for the following year based on the final decisions that are made. Clearly, there are a number of things that happen during the course of the year that could result in changes in that deficit. But the reason why we stay to one number throughout the year is because our bond rating agencies and investors rely on that as a benchmark. We could be changing the deficit every week based on, increases in revenue here or increases in expenditures there. And so we try not to. But having said that, we thought it was important to give you sort of a sense of where it's at, so that you could start thinking about how to proceed as we begin in the budget season. To reemphasize what we listed out in our crossroads report, there are three factors that are going to impact the deficit. The first is the fact that we're starting to reap the benefits of some of the pension reform that all of you have adopted. Our pension costs, while still growing, they're growing at about 11%. They're not growing at 15%, which is what we had originally calculated a few years ago. So there's a savings from how we projected our deficits in the past based on that reduction in contribution towards our pensions of about 45 million. We're also seeing that our revenues are getting better, and we could see the changes in the economy. Our economists, for the most part, are giving a positive outlook for the future. And so we don't call the final revenue until the budget is just about ready to go to the printer, because we want to have the most accurate information. But it's fair to say that revenue projections will probably be somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2.7, 2.8% growth, which is, if you run a small business, that certainly is a healthy growth rate, and not the highest it's ever been, also certainly not the lowest that we've experienced. And then in addition to that, because you have been steadfast in dealing with this year's deficit as it comes, and we hit the 5% reserve fund, we're starting to build a budget stabilization fund. And that's any new revenue that comes in that's not anticipated is going straight into the budget stabilization fund. And that's the revenue that Dr. Rhodes talked about in terms of the encumbrance exercise that we went through, as well as other revenues that we have been able to identify. And we hope to get the budget stabilization fund, $70 to $80 million. Now, keep in mind about that fund. That fund is one-time money. So it does nothing to eliminate the structural deficit. The structural deficit is an ongoing problem. It's one of the solutions for next year, if you choose to do that, to address next year's deficit. But as an ongoing, unless you plan of always having a budget stabilization fund of about $70, $80 million a year, then it's not a structural solution. So if you use all of it up next year, then you have to confront that problem again the following year. And so that's why it's not a solution to eliminating the structural deficit, just simply next year's shortfall. Having said all that, and given the fact that the voters have responded on a new revenue option, we do lay out some advice as to how to proceed in the future. And while we are seeing signs of good news, we also are seeing some things to be concerned about. New revenue is not the only thing that drives the deficit. New expenditures are as well. And ultimately, any new expenditures will be made, those decisions will be made in the context of the budget, but we already know that the fire and police departments are asking for a significant amount of new revenue simply to maintain the status quo and level of services. And so that is not accounted for in the deficit for next year. But again, at the end, the final determination of what the projected out-year deficits will be made when the mayor's budget is released, and ultimately when you adopt your final budget that's ultimately supported by the mayor. In our report, we do provide an emphasis on the need to be mindful of ongoing versus one-time solutions. The city will be in a situation next year where we'll have, for the first time in the last 4 years, a significant amount of one-time revenue. You have the choice to basically use every penny of one-time revenue to close the budget deficit. And you do that and you get about a year to 6 month reprieve, and then are forced to confront it yet again and then some the following year. And while doing that, are not considering significant one-time expenditures, such the need to buy black and white police cars, which we haven't done to the extent that we need to, or to deal with our capital infrastructure in our buildings, or to deal with quality of life issues like our roads and our sidewalks. We believe that in light of the fact that the voters have made a decision that a new revenue option is not in the cards, at least for now, that it's important that we go back and start investing a significant portion of that one-time revenue into one-time items. You'll hear from the police department when they're up here, but I think it's very hard for them to survive another year without new police black and whites. They're now becoming much more expensive to maintain, and because of the short lifespan of a police car, it's hard to actually borrow for that need. We have major liabilities pertaining to our sidewalks, and it's a very complicated case, which you've all heard in closed session multiple times. But the need to invest at least some funding for our sidewalks in those areas where the city clearly has responsibility is something that I recommend you consider for next year. There's been some discussion, certainly the controller has raised some concern about police overtime and the bank that's growing in police overtime. That is something that was done as a short-term measure, as a way to control overtime, which was at about $80 to $100 million a year. Those banks are starting to grow, and we would advise you to actually take a stab at paying that down. Obviously not all of it, but a sizable chunk to reduce some of the liability. Those would be reasonable and responsible things to consider for one-time revenue. Now, of course, as you move forward and use one-time revenue for one-time items, it means you have less revenue to deal with the ongoing shortfall. And so that means that difficult decisions around maintaining our budget, not just for next year, but on an ongoing basis, will continue. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Rosenfeld.
Yeah, just curious, there was a piece in the Daily Breeze that talked about LAX, and talked about police overtime, and talked about reimbursements. Did you see that piece?
No, I have not, but I'm somewhat familiar with the
Yeah, I'd have somebody find that out for you, because I don't want to express what that reporter expressed, but their bottom line was they felt that the city was taking advantage of overtime hours in a way where the police union guy of the airport crowd took a different position, and that's in today's newspaper, and I'd love your thoughts on that.
Okay, I'll be happy to look at that. The specific liability I'm referring to pertains to LAPD and the general fund. Obviously, any overtime that's incurred as a result of LAWA gets paid for out of LAWA's budget. But I'll certainly look at that and report back to you on.
Okay, what city revenue categories have seen the most growth over the last year, and what can be attributed to the growth in these categories?
Well, the city is very fortunate in that it has a very diverse revenue stream, okay? The largest percentage of revenue comes from property taxes, and property taxes are also the most stable due to Proposition 13. Ironically, because when the economy does really well and everybody's property values goes up, because of Prop 13, the assessed value doesn't go up as rapidly. So that means when the crash comes, we don't experience as much of a drop. That's different. That's unique to California. Other jurisdictions saw dramatic drops in their property taxes.
Sure, and on Prop 13, remember that they have not taken old companies and necessarily upgraded them to the new law, and so a guy across the street can be paying $10 and the other one $2. And I had used the phrase gold in the gutter, like there was $7 billion sitting there that needs to be collected. In fact, I chaired a commission on taxing policy for the new economy, and it was Republicans and Democrats and Independent after 17 hearings. That was one of the recommendations, is to pick that up. Do you have any sense of where we are with the fairness of Prop 13 to businesses?
Well, I think that ultimately will be in the hands of the state legislature and the voters of California to revisit Prop 13 as it's discussed, as it's currently framed, and ultimately...
I would love for us to put some policy position forward as a council, saying let's get the gold out of the gutter that are those businesses in Prop 13 that are not paying what the one across the street is. It's a competition issue. That is a significant issue.
So the other revenue streams are documentary transfer tax, which is growing due to the growth in sales that are property sales are occurring. It's somewhat dangerous tax because it grows rapidly during booms and then drops quickly during busts. And so our sales tax is expected to grow as the unemployment rate goes down. Our utility tax is likely to continue to decline as we're experiencing. Our hotel tax is doing well as we're having an increased number of visitors. So overall, we're expecting, like I said, an overall growth of about 2.8. 6%.
What specific pieces of the pension reform passed by the voters on the sworn side and passed by the council on the civilian side have allowed us to potentially reduce our pension contribution by up to $45 million?
Well, it's the aggregate of all of those reforms, frankly, that has helped reduce our pension, reduce the speed in which our pension costs are growing. It's hard to, certainly the work that the pension systems have done has helped. The fact that we had some good years of the stock market, we also had some not so good years. The fact that the size of the workforce is at an all-time low. The new pension tier on the sworn side, obviously the new pension tier on the civilian side becomes effective July 1st.
Yeah.
Another one is the contribution to retiree health care. That's a major piece in that solution.
Yeah, just quickly, Mr. Chair, two more. We heard that the failure of Measure A would result in dramatic cuts in public safety and even a forced reduction of 500 LAPD officers. With the defeat of Measure A and this daunting $150 million to $65 million deficit projection, what kind of impacts are we potentially looking at in the police and fire departments?
I think it's going to be very hard not to have some impacts throughout the city, including public safety. The efforts to enhance and restore the cuts done in the fire department are going to be very, very difficult and not impossible to do. It's no secret, I think the mayor will continue to support hiring to attrition, but there's going to be challenges to the rest of the system as we move forward. There'll be trade-offs associated with that. It's important to think about Measure A not just in the context of 1 year. It's as the city struggles to close projected shortfalls in the future because our revenue is simply not growing to the same rate as our expenditures. The ability to maintain a firewall of public safety is going to be more and more challenged because of the significant percentage of the budget that they make now. So I think what you're going to see in the next few years is an ongoing conversation about the public safety program that we have as a city, and certainly being able to do any restorations are going to be very, very challenging.
And my last question is, looking ahead to the tax and revenue anticipation notes issuance for next fiscal year, are we looking at dramatic increases in the interest rates as a result of the sequestration? How many additional basic points could we be looking at, the worst case scenario, and what would that equate to in additional dollars?
Interest rates are obviously in record lows today. They're expected to hover in the place that they are for the next several months, probably the next year and a half, 2 years. The concern we had as it relates to the issue you raised was that there was and continues to be a conversation around capping the tax-exempt bonds that we all issue. That's tax-exempt bonds are sort of the lifeblood of municipal governments and state governments around the country. It's what makes us competitive in issuing bonds. If we can't issue tax-exempt bonds, then it makes our bonds less attractive, and then that drives what we end up paying, and that increase would be significant. So fortunately, that has only been around issue of a discussion and hasn't actually really occurred.
On that, if I could just pipe in, that was the key issue we had just gone to Washington on, in fact, on that very issue. And together with Joe Buscaino, the two of us went to numerous members of Congress and both of our state senators and met with all of them, including all of the members from Los Angeles as well. And while it has been a conversation, there was unanimous support that they would never go for either the cap, which is what was talked about at 28%, or an elimination of that exemption. And we explained how that would cripple their districts back home and cities and counties throughout the nation. And so there was support across the board to try to kill that. And there's no formal bill right now on that. It's just conversation, but it appears from the conversations we had and that's a big issue. I appreciate you bringing it up. That's not going to happen, but we'll monitor.
Mr. Chris. Yeah, if we do wind up making some of our expenditures one time in the course of the coming budget, are we looking at trying to lean on one-time efficiency expenditures? Because there are things like our asphalt plant, which I've been talking about refurbishing and essentially replacing for the last 4 years. It would clearly drive our costs down, and I actually finally visited it a couple months ago, and it really appears that it's held together with glue. It's very outdated. Our people are doing amazing things with it, but really should be replaced. And not only would it increase our capacity and save us a lot of money, but it would probably pay for itself entirely within a year or two. We have some opportunities like that, which we pass on each year because we're too broke. Perhaps this year would be a year where if we have the one-time savings, we can put it into things that will actually produce more revenue for us in the future.
And I think those are exactly the kind of things we should be looking at. Because of our fiscal crisis, we haven't had really the opportunity to invest in a number of areas, including those that help us ultimately become more efficient. And so we can't ignore that anymore. And so we continue to recommend that there be a program around those areas, those capital expenditures, particularly those that result in greater savings and efficiency in the long term.
Very good.
Well, on that point, it certainly makes sense to focus one-time expenditures in those areas that will realize longer-term efficiencies and savings and produce beneficial results in future years as well. But at the same time, the point of having a budget stabilization fund at the same time that we already have a 5% reserve fund was to ease the pain of cutting as we needed to cut to address the structural deficit problem in this year and in the next couple of years. So you're not suggesting, are you, that the budget stabilization fund should be used entirely for one-time expenditures and not for relieving the pain of addressing the structural deficit, are you? Because I thought that was the whole point of having it.
No, the point of our report is to say that as you look at the structural deficit for next year, it should be a goal to try to identify at least allow that 70% of the solutions that are adopted to reduce that deficit be ongoing solutions. So that we don't have to confront that 70% the following year, and that we limit the one-time solutions to only 30% of the solutions overall. So every year we've had to rely on some one-time money to be able to close the shortfall, and that's certainly going to have to be the case next year, and probably the year after that. But if we don't start changing the equation of ongoing versus one-time, then we're never going to get out of this place, so out of the situation that we're in. So ultimately, the goal should be to eliminate the deficit altogether. Obviously, it can't happen overnight. We didn't do the 80% overnight. It's going to take some time, but it means that there has to be some focus on sort of a reasonable percentage.
Mr. England.
Thank you. Just a couple quick notes and thoughts, questions. On the black and whites, you'd mentioned that we haven't purchased them in some time, but I think last year we actually purchased about 125 or so. So there were some.
Not some, but certainly not the number that the department requires and has been in need of. And so the city doesn't have an ongoing program to replace black and whites, and that's really what the emphasis is that, we know we'll need them, so we need to start just planning for them and just getting in the practice of replacing them on a more systematic basis.
At least most of our officers carpool. And then on the sequestration, that was brought up earlier on sequestration. Are there other anticipated impacts? I know you've put out a paper on that as well. And I've seen that as well, but as it relates to, are we programming that into the proposed budget? Are we looking at that seriously so we're not coming up with a budget and then, we've got to readjust and recalibrate at some point at an FSR because we didn't know, in fact, that we weren't going to be getting these grant funds, but we have to maintain these unfunded now mandated programs or whatever that might be. Are we preparing the budget to account for that?
I wish we were, but we don't have enough information to do that. So the most likely scenario is going to be exactly what you said, where as information comes in, then we'll have to confront it at that time. The administration didn't, while they certainly talked a lot about the impact prior to sequestration becoming effective, the information about how it's being implemented hasn't been as clear. And so there isn't at least one item that I know of right now. My staff could be working on something as we speak that specifically says that effective this date, we won't have this funding. I don't know if, Ray, if you know of any so far, but we anticipate that will be trickled in throughout the rest of the calendar year.
I think if I might just add on that, we are, as much as we can and what we know, we're trying to incorporate into the budget, especially in areas of some of the block grants, some of the other housing funds. We're as far as, I know we don't know everything, but we're getting some sense, and so we are working with the mayor, trying to sort of plan with some anticipation how we deal with some of those funds. So,
as that moves forward, while funds are getting cut out of Washington because they're going to continue to do that as this goes forward. They've already started, as we know, pulling back a lot of their own internal programs, big and small. But with that, if there's some other track that we can perhaps explore, rather than wait for an entire quarter to be eaten up, that if we know there's a direct program that they're not going to be funding or they pulled back on, and we can take immediate action to either cut or reduce or look at that program, either other revenue streams or whatever it is we need to do, have a constant monitor with our folks in D.C. on that. I think it's critically important so we don't turn around and look at a sequestration deficit because we've continued programs where we thought we would be getting either reimbursement or revenue from. That's something we might want to look at. And you'd mentioned that perhaps in the budget, in the mayor's budget, and I know we're not going to get into all the details on this right now, and you're going to have a more comprehensive agenda tonight on this, but on you'd mentioned the attrition rate, hiring to attrition in LAPD. What number might that be? In other words, where are we at now on approved thresholds? Our staffing levels are at what?
I think we'll end the year at over 10,000 officers.
But are we going to move that number back up to the 10? I mean, right now, we never formally approved a new number. We kept it at 99, 98, 67. What was the, whatever?
I forget, yeah, I know there's 4 more classes scheduled, so.
There's 3 more, there's still, I think, 4 or 5 classes, 4 classes that are going to be higher this year. I think that's still moving forward. And I would be surprised if there's any changes for next year in terms of the number of classes that we've been on track for hiring. But ultimately, we'll see in the mayor's budget what that looks like.
We'll see what, okay. For a further conversation. And then my last comment and question was on PBB. And I think there's more demand now, particularly in light of all of these discussions that we're having on priority-based budgeting than ever. And we recently had a demonstration come in from the Center for Priority-Based Budgeting, a nonprofit that had met with several of us. It was a very good demonstration, but the whole idea, though, is to not just have the conversation as we have been, which, given the process and the tools that you have, I applaud your office and your leadership and what we've had to deal with in making broad decisions, but getting into more of the details of each particular department and the programs, perhaps, that they offer, and doing a full inventory, I think, is critically important, where we can start looking at, sooner rather than later, hopefully we can get that done this year, at a minimum, is a full inventory of every department and all the programs that they offer, and then categorizing if they're special funded or they're general funded departments or programs specifically, and so we can start making those decisions based on, rather, do we just put $50 million back into the fire department, or do we just buy black and whites rather than those kinds of conversations actually get into the weeds of the details of what are the 200 programs they offer or 300 programs each department offers. And, figure out, are there ways to do things better or differently, or partnerships with other municipalities, and making some of those detailed decisions. So I hope to continue those conversations on PBB going into this budget year as well.
I think it's important because ultimately that's
Joanna called.
Ultimately that's the best way of making sure that your priorities are funded to the extent that you want, and there's a real accountability to outcomes. One of the disappointing parts of being in crisis all the time is that our goal is just to survive another month, and that's not really the way you manage a city. It should be much more long-term, and now that the voters have spoken, regardless of whatever deficit we're facing, we need to move forward in a direction where we're proactively finding ways to manage a budget as a living, breathing document, and in fact a reflection of your priorities.
And then I think it's a great opportunity and time to do that now, because we've never really set what those priorities are. We've never defined what they are.
That's the hardest part.
Well, and we've identified, but yes, it is. It is, but we've talked about that for a long time, and it was, in fact, Mr. Krikorian and I sat through a way on a process on how we would develop and measure what those objectives are, what those core functions are, what those priorities are. And I think we need to start moving in that direction. Now's the great time to do that as we enter into the new year. We'll have a new mayor and a lot of new council members to be able to sit around and dialogue and develop that process, as well as define those objectives and the missions for each one of the objectives.
That's right.
So it should be an exciting time to get into those details. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rosendahl.
Yeah, from day one, before you came on board, I always talked about zero-based budgeting. That's what I did in the private sector for 22 years when I ran a conglomerate. Every year, we put everything up to see if we could justify it or not. When I first came to the council, as you know, I've talked about health care and pension reform. I mean, I come from the private sector. I understand the reality of it. Though, I must tell you that government workers work really hard, and I believe in living wages. And to me, a living wage ain't no $10 an hour. And I can't believe in Washington, these people aren't even talking significant monies, which is like $25 an hour if you want to avoid complete insanity and trying to make ends meet. I know that personally now from the healthcare world that I have become part of. So where are we with that whole notion again of zero-based budgeting and forcing that into a fresh discussion?
Again, that's been one of the unfortunate casualties of having to live in the way that we have, is that we haven't had the it's when the zero keeps on getting below zero. So, being able, and why Measure A was important, because it would have provided us sort of the breathing room so we could plan more effectively.
Yeah.
We still need to do that while we're trying to be balanced at the same time.
Mr. Kretz.
Yeah, you mentioned that you think the mayor is still going to propose ongoing hiring to attrition. We talked in the Measure A campaign about the fact that we could wind up having to even lay off as many as 500 officers. How do we have credibility if we're choosing to continuing to be one of the very few cities in the country to hire more police officers? Has the mayor looked at that?
Well, I think a budget is your reflection of your priorities, and it starts with the mayor, and then it goes to your council. I think that will be one of the discussion points I'm sure that you will be having as you move forward through the budget process.
Fair enough.
Well, and on a kind of a related topic, there's been a lot of public discussion about assumptions that some in the public are making that the deficit estimates are wildly inaccurate because they've changed and fluctuated all over the place. And I think we've had a little bit of discussion about that already today, and I think even our public commenters made clear that this is always going to be a number that is changing from quarter to quarter, from month to month, depending on economic circumstances and so on. But I would like you to speak to that point. Dr. Rhodes mentioned the change from the October to February FSR, and that there were changed assumptions relating to the deficit in that, but the deficit figure was still pegged at the same number. And so I'd like you to speak to that, and then also the current estimate of the deficit for next year. What assumptions does that take into account? What changes does it take into account from the 216 to the current 150 to 165 million dollars?
So, as I started off saying, the deficit is defined at the end of the budget process. So, the budget itself has not just sort of a description of how that year's shortfall is being addressed, but it lays out projections out in the future. And the reason why we limit changes to defining the deficit to that period of time is because the public, the bond rating agencies, investors rely on that as a sort of as a benchmark. Throughout the year, things change. Sometimes they get better, sometimes they get worse, and sometimes it's both happening at the same time. And as you stated, we could change the deficit every month based on that new information. Not necessarily helpful, because it gives you a moment in time, and it doesn't capture the decisions that are made on the expenditure side. So actually, the hearing, the comments made by Dr. Rhodes, they're not inconsistent with what we said. The only difference is that the one-time revenue that's found in the Budget Stabilization Fund or the encumbrance exercise is exactly that, is one-time revenue. So we don't account for any one-time revenues as a solution to the structural deficit, because they go away the year after. But the reduction in the pension contribution, that means that there's going to be a trajectory. The trajectory of pension costs have gone down. So that does eliminate the structural deficit. It's an ongoing, and the increase in revenue, that's an ongoing. Now, you'll get a recommendation on how do we maintain a budget stabilization fund in the future. And one of the recommendations is going to be that when revenues go beyond trend line, we actually consider those revenues one time, and not get in the situation where we're building up the size of a government, assuming that the economy is going to grow forever, and which never happens. That's on the revenue side. On the expenditure side, the decisions you make on what to add to the budget increase the deficit. So if we were to fund all the requests made by every single department, in the budget process, then the deficit would be significantly higher the following year and the year after that. And some of the things that we accounted for in our report were some assumptions based on what we knew on funding, staffing, certain levels in the police department, just to maintain the status quo. Now,
So on that point, the current budget deficit estimates are based on the assumption of continuing to hire to attrition in the police department.
The status quo, correct. So until there's a change in direction by the city leadership, then we assume the status quo on an ongoing. It's not our decision. It's not the CAO making a policy decision on that. It's just we treat all expenditures the same, as assumed to continue, unless both on the increase and the decrease as we grow or contract the deficit. So that's why, in the context of the discussion of Measure A, and perhaps some were saying that Measure A wasn't necessary because the economy is getting better, we're seeing increases in our revenue, reductions in our pension cost. That was, and filling in the rest with one-time money, that was really a short-sighted way of looking at our budget issue, because it assumes that after July 1st of next year, sort of everything stops. and Measure A was really an ongoing solution for an ongoing problem. And it also assumes that you're ignoring all of your other responsibilities to buy police cars, to maintain our sidewalks, to deal with our infrastructure in a more responsible way than we've done now. And so...
Is it our mistake you're not getting the message out properly? Was it having Chief Beck when he is in the middle of a million thing? What was the reason in your mind? Because to me, it seemed like a necessary no-brainer, where my folks in the 11th District were the ones that would have paid the most under the new strategy, which is what you're telling me right now, property transfer tax, this and that and the other. Were we unable? I mean, if you could reflect, if you can. If you can't, you can't, I understand. The world's crazy.
Maybe that sums it up. It's hard for me to speculate, and I'm not a political scientist, to sort of conclude why the outcome was what it was. I think what I do know is that the city does need either ongoing reductions or ongoing revenues to ultimately eliminate the structural deficit. It's nothing short of that. There's no magic involved here.
Thank you. Okay, colleagues, anything further? Well, one moment. Why don't we do this? We had already actually concluded comment on this matter, but we've just received another card from Mr. Handel. So if you would, Mr. Santana, if you could just step aside there for Mr. Handel, and then we'll wrap this one up. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, for indulging me. I'm running between meetings on the floor. Jay Handel, Chair of the Budget Advocates Citywide. First of all, I want to thank the CAO and his office for a great weekend of budget days that we had as neighborhood council people. Unfortunately, I was back east, but I heard it went over really well. Having said that, I'd like to maybe throw a little perspective to Councilmember Rosendahl as to why people voted no. People don't trust the leadership anymore. That's the bottom line. Again, I've given this speech before. I'm going to give it again. 2 years ago in July, when it was said we're going to hold off layoffs until December, but in December, if we don't have it, we're going to have to get rid of at least 200 civilian employees in the police department. December came, we found $3 million. The next budget cycle came, we were going to have to do layoffs. We didn't do it. And now we've compromised our chief of police by making him a political tool, by standing him up on TV in a suit for 3 weeks, telling everybody the sky is falling, and if you don't vote for this, you will be scared because you will lose policemen. And in 24 hours after losing the vote, everything was fine. The mayor comes out and says, it's not as bad as we thought it was going to be. Why do you think nobody votes? Nobody cares. Why does nobody care? Nobody believes anything that comes out of this building anymore. So the credibility gap is the gap in the 20% of people who don't vote. And if this council, if the budget committee wants to put out true numbers, we knew as budget advocates that it was $40 to $50 million weeks ago watching TV. We were told what the different numbers were that were coming down and where it was coming from and where the increases in revenues came. Yet you guys still went on TV and tried to scare the hell out of the public. I'm sorry. The days are over and the people aren't as stupid as they used to be. So it's really coming down to credibility, guys. Really coming down to credibility. Thank you.
All right. Colleagues, there's a recommendation that the council, subject to the approval of the mayor, instruct the CAO to report to the EERC with a framework on how to achieve savings from options, including but not limited to reducing or maintaining the current employee compensation levels, reducing or maintaining the current employee health care costs, and mitigating the future and ongoing impact of cost of living increases, and to instruct the CAO to report back on potential service reductions, departmental consolidations, efficiencies, potential revenue and collection opportunities. These are reports back to the EERC and this committee, respectively, on those topics. There's no other action than that report before us. I'd entertain a motion on that, if you'd like to proceed with those recommendations? All right. And is there any objection to those? All right, then without objection, that will be the action of the committee. And is there any other business before us? All right, then we are adjourned.
Last item.
Thank you all very much. Oh, before we adjourn, I'm sorry, just wanted to announce for those who hadn't otherwise heard that at 6 o'clock tonight, we'll be conducting a special meeting of the Budget and Finance Committee in council chambers in City Hall. There will be public access available in Van Nuys City Hall and in San Pedro. You can also get updates about it on Twitter and otherwise. Just go to our website and check it out. The point of this meeting this evening will not be to take action, but rather to provide an opportunity for greater public input and a presentation on the current state of the budget for the coming year and the current year in order to allow the greatest degree of public engagement. So that will be tonight beginning at 6 o'clock. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.